Okay, the Subcommittee on Immigration and Citizenship may now come to order. We have a quorum present, and without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. I'd like to remind members that we have established an email address and distribution list dedicated to circulating amendments, exhibits, motions, or any other written material that members might want to offer as part of our meeting today. If you would like to submit materials, please send them to the email address that has previously been distributed to your offices, and we will circulate the materials to members and staff as quickly as we can. I'm going to skip the mask guidance because I believe every member today is participating virtually, but any staff that's in the committee room, please do recall that anyone in the committee room is required to wear a mask at all times. Finally, I would ask all members to mute their microphone when you're not speaking. That's going to help a lot to diminish background noise, and it will allow us all to hear each other better. Before going to our committee rules and the private bills that we will consider today, I'd like to note that we have one member who is not able to attend today, Mr. Nagoose, who's over at the Senate trial, and we have a new ranking member, Tom McClintock, my colleague from California. And Tom, I wonder if you would like to introduce the new members of the subcommittee.
Republican side, of course, Kent Buck, the former chairman of this subcommittee. Andy Biggs, at least during the crime committee this year. I saw Tom who's joining us. And I think those are the three Republicans that are on right now.
Okay, we also have Mr. Chip Ray from Texas and Victoria Sparks from Indiana, who are going to be members. And
oh, I see Victoria now. I'm sorry. I'm still getting used to this gadget here. Okay, very good.
Okay. Okay, so I just would like to introduce the adoption of our committee rules, and pursuant to notice, I call up the subcommittee rule of procedure and statement of policy for private immigration bills for the purpose of markup, and I will, at the appropriate time, move that the subcommittee adopt them. I'd like to note that the primary focus of these rules is to establish the standards and requirements for the consideration of private immigration bills. These standards have been set on a bipartisan basis and have effectively remained for about the last 30 years. There are a couple of changes that I am proposing in the bills in the rules this year, primarily technical in nature, and I would like to explain them briefly. They're intended to clarify private bill requirements, correct typographical errors, reflect updated terminology, including that which is currently used in the Immigration and Nationality Act. There are two specific changes that are worth highlighting. The first is a change to Rule 4, which describes when the subcommittee will request a stay of removal on behalf of the beneficiary of a private bill. Typically, a stay of removal will only be requested if, at a formal meeting, the subcommittee agrees to request an investigative report on the beneficiary from the Department of Homeland Security. The change in Rule 4 clarifies that a stay of removal may also be requested if removal of the beneficiary is imminent and the chair and ranking member have agreed to schedule a meeting to vote on a request for a DHS report as soon as practicable. This has actually occurred many times in the past, and I think it's important that our rules reflect that policy. It has only occurred when the chair and ranking member agree, and it has not been possible to schedule the meeting in the time frame that's necessary. The second major rule involves a statement of policy on medical cases. This came up in the last Congress when we had an issue of whether a person a beneficiary would be able to receive medical care that was very specialized in her country of birth. The rules require a report from the World Health Organization, and they had not responded. And it occurred to me that it is really inappropriate for the Congress of the United States to essentially delegate a legislative decision to an international body. And so this rule adds a provision that the evidence on medical care may come from any source that the committee finds credible. In that case, it would have been, I think it was Stanford Medical Center, but there are certainly medical centers in the United States that the committee might find credible, and that would be added to the bill. We were going to try and do this last year, but we never had the time to do it. But the ranking member and Mr. Jordan both agreed when I talked to him about that. The other issue, and there may be an amendment or further discussion on this, has to do with changing the word legal and illegal to authorized and unauthorized. And I'd like to explain why that proposal has been made. Many of us, I'll include myself, object to the idea of people being called illegals. There's a divergence of opinion. This proposal has nothing to do with that dispute. There is a distinction in terms of illegal entry and unauthorized entry. Right now, it is a misdemeanor to enter the United States without authorization. However, if you enter with a visa and you're inspected, but you have entered without a proper intent, or you have overstayed that visa, it would be unauthorized, but our rules would not actually implicate that. And so I'll confess to doing something that is quite nerdy. Over the summer, in thinking that we might have a chance to completely revamp the Immigration and Nationality Act, I read every single page of the Immigration and Nationality Act, taking a look at how we might amend it. And I will say that there are provisions in the act that are inconsistent, that are poorly written, that are repetitive. And one of the goals I have as we proceed in this Congress is to clean up the language and to make it clear. And so that really is the origin of this proposal, not my sense that, not everyone agrees that we should categorize people by their entry. So with that, I would like to put these, call up the subcommittee rules and move that the subcommittee adopt them and ask if there are any amendments to these rules.
Madam Chairman?
Yes, sir.
Madam Chairman, first I want to begin by saying how much I'm looking forward to working with you this session. Although our opinions and policy preferences might be vastly different, I've always respected your professional approach to the process that brings us together. There's all differences. I just hope we'll quickly restore that process, including in-person hearings, which allow so much better interaction with members. As you point out, the first matter before us is the rules and statement of policy to govern the subcommittee's consideration of private immigration bills. I agree with you. Private bills are essentially request to circumvent law. We utilize this process as a last resort for situations of extraordinary circumstances. Without these standards, this subcommittee would request from members to move private immigration bills. The rules and statement of policy not only set out what the bill's sponsor must provide to the subcommittee as evidence, but also provide notice to members and potential beneficiaries as to the likelihood of whether or not their bill could be considered by Congress. The rules and statement of policy we're considering today remain largely the same as previous Congresses. However, you pointed out, the majority has made some changes. Most of them are necessary and reasonable given the changing circumstances over the years. You mentioned one of them, the statement of policy seeking to provide flexibility regarding the documentation required to show whether there's adequate medical care in the country of origin of the individual affected, making an advisory opinion of the World Health Organization or the Pan American Health Organization optional rather than required. In such advisory opinion will still be provided, but other credible evidence of lack of adequate medical care would also be acceptable. This change is reasonable given that the WHO no longer routinely provides advisory opinions as those required under the prior rule. However, I am very much concerned with one change proposed for Rule 1B in the provision that describes the entry of aliens into the United States as legal and illegal. The majority would change this to authorized and unauthorized. Well, words matter. The terms legal and illegal have been used historically to describe the entry of aliens to the United States because it is a crime to enter the United States without going through the proper process and receiving the U.S. government's permission to enter. If it's not illegal to enter the United States without complying with the law, well, then the law becomes meaningless. An act either complies with the law or it does not. So at the appropriate time, I will offer an amendment to restore the traditional wording to this provision. As I noted, the other changes proffered by the majority are sensible, and I appreciate the chair's willingness to accept our feedback and make two edits that we requested, namely the retention of the word exclusion, Rule 1A, and some additional wording in Rule 4. I want to thank the chairman for her commitment to the long-standing policy regarding the agreement to only move bills that fall under the private bill precedent. This policy was put in place in the wake of the abscam scandal of the 1980s, in which members of Congress were accepting money in return for moving private bills. The agreement is reasonable. It served this subcommittee well, and I hope to be able to urge my colleagues to adopt this rules package, but that recommendation is to be based on whether or not the amendment I plan to offer is adopted. Now I yield back the balance of my time.
Now would be the time to offer an amendment, Mr. McClintock.
Okay, well, if that's the case, then I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will please read the amendment.
An amendment offered by Mr. McClintock of California. In Rule 1, Clause B, after entries, strike authorized and
Will the clerk
unauthorized.
please read the amendment?
In Rule 1, Clause B, after entries, strike authorized and unauthorized and insert legal and illegal.
Do we have the amendment to be read? Apparently, we're distributing it now.
An amendment offered by Mr. McClintock of California. In Rule 1, Clause B, after entries, strike authorized and unauthorized and insert legal and illegal.
So the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Great. Again, I want to thank you, Madam Chairman. As I indicated a moment ago, all but one of the changes the majority wants to make to the rules and the statement of policy are necessary and fair and reasonable. But the proposed change to Rule 1B, the majority is fundamentally altering the nature of our immigration law by suggesting that violating it is not an illegal act. I think this is important for two reasons. As I explained earlier, if violating a law is not illegal, the law becomes meaningless. And second, in recent years, the debate over legal and illegal immigration has blurred the distinction between these two very different concepts. Our nation is founded on legal immigration, the process by which immigrants from around the world come here in order to become Americans. Our immigration laws are specifically written to assure that the process of assimilation, which is indispensable to a nation of immigrants, is fulfilled. Illegal immigration undermines the entire process of legal immigration upon which our nation is founded. And I think it's vital to keep that distinction clear. So let's be specific. Title 8, Section 1325A of the U.S. Code reads, any alien who, one, enters or attempts to enter the United States or place other than designated by immigration officers, or two, eludes examination or inspection by immigration officers, or three, attempts to enter or obtain entry to the United States by willfully false or misleading representation, or the willful concealment of a material effect, shall, for the first commission of any such offense, be fined under Title 18 or imprisoned not more than 6 months or both, and for a subsequent commission of any such offense, be fined under Title 18 or imprisoned not more than 2 years or both, end quote. So any alien who enters the U.S. without permission to do so has committed an illegal act and can be charged with a crime. I realize that today many are not. That underscores the importance of these laws. Simply because an individual is not charged with a crime doesn't mean the action they took was any less illegal. Over the last several years, open border advocates have pushed a narrative aimed at removing the stigma associated with illegal immigration. One of their tactics is to stop calling it what it is, illegal. Instead, they deliberately equate it with the millions of legal immigrants who've obeyed our laws, waited patiently in line, and done everything our country has asked of them to do, only to watch hundreds of thousands of illegal immigrants make a mockery of them. To blur this distinction is an insult to legal immigrants and an encouragement to those who flagrantly disregard our laws and disrespect the sovereignty of our nation. If foreign nationals entered the United States in violation of 8 U.S.C. 1325A, he has entered the U.S. illegally, and our subcommittee rules ought to reflect that. My amendment would return the wording of Rule 1B to legal and illegal. It's a common sense amendment that uses language that's been satisfactory to this subcommittee under both Republican and Democratic majorities over many years. So I'd urge my colleagues to support the amendment, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and the chair recognizes herself in opposition to the amendment. Let me first say I understand the points that you have made, and there are people in Congress and in the country who have engaged in vigorous debate on the points that you have raised. This rule change, however, is unrelated to that argument. The current framework, as I said, I have gone through the entire Immigration and Nationality Act this summer, and one of the things that it's important to do is to be precise. The term illegal entry appears in the Immigration and Nationality Act in many places. It's used in a generic sense to describe individuals who enter without inspection. However, the term authorized and unauthorized also appears in the Immigration and Nationality Act, and it carries specific meaning that is actually broader than the terms in our rules. Section 214, which governs the admission of non-immigrants, uses the term to describe individuals who are authorized to enter or stay in the United States. The term is used again to describe how long certain individuals who have been admitted can be authorized to remain. As such, the term authorized is used to describe not only individuals who've entered with permission, but also those who are maintaining their status in the United States. Conversely, a person who is unauthorized is a person who entered without inspection or who was inspected and admitted, but later violated their status or remained beyond the authorized period of stay granted by Customs and Border permission. And so the use of authorized or unauthorized actually broadens the provisions beyond the use of the word illegal that was currently in the rules. Now, I understand that we may later have this discussion in our committee and in the subcommittee on the issues you've raised in Title 18. But it is important, I think, that our rules reflect that someone can be inspected, enter on a visa, and yet be unauthorized. And the committee rules ask that every entry, both authorized and unauthorized, inspected, and not all entries and departures be listed by the author of the bill. And I think this rule change better reflects our obligation here. Respectfully, is not really related to the issue that you have raised, which I may or may not agree with you on, but it's off the point on what I'm trying to do with this proposed rule change. Would others like to be heard on this matter? Please indicate by raising your virtual hand or letting the staff know.
Madam Chair,
Yes, sir. Who is
this is Ken.
Mr. Buck,
I move to strike the last word.
you recognize for 5 minutes.
Thank you. And I'd like to just engage in a dialogue on this in good faith. I'm really trying to understand this a little bit better, but I understand Mr. McClintock's point, and I'm wondering whether the language should be illegal or unauthorized as opposed to just unauthorized, because it seems to me that someone who enters the country without permission, enters in without proper documentation, enters illegally. If they enter legally and stay beyond the terms of the visa, they are then unauthorized. And in order to cover both categories, would it make sense to say illegal and unauthorized? And I don't know whether the gentleman would accept a friendly amendment or not, but if the chair would be interested in entertaining that, that is what I'm curious about.
I would, Mr. Buck, absolutely.
Let me just, if I may, if the gentleman would yield.
Yes.
The word unauthorized covers everything. We made a distinction. The gentleman was not in the Congress in 1996 when we did the last more thorough change in immigration law, but we made irrational distinctions for people who were unauthorized or not in compliance with the law, between those who were inspected and those who were uninspected. And I have wanted throughout to make sure that we equalize the authorization and unauthorization in ways that are very clear. Mr. McClintock and Mr. Beck, I'm sure we're going to get into the issue that you're raising, which is a substantive one having to do with Title 18. But I would hope that the amendment and the proposed amendment to the amendment, which we'll accept by unanimous consent just because we don't want to take up more time on that, would be rejected, that we can, understanding that this is really not the issue that you have raised, accept these rules and get on to our hearing. Who else is asked to be? Ms. Garcia, have you asked? Oh, Mr. Buck, you still have time. I don't want to.
I yield back. I thank the chair.
Mr. Buck yields back. Ms. Garcia, you have asked to be recognized and to strike the last word. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move to strike the last word. And first of all, I must commend you for reading the entire Naturalization Act. I don't think I even got through it all when I took immigration law in law school. But let me just say that I don't recall when I was in law school many moons ago studying this topic that we ever used the word legal and illegal. We did always use authorized or unauthorized. And as someone who is a person of faith, you know, I strongly believe that we are all children of God. And I strongly believe that no human being is illegal. I've always seen it as a very derogatory, very negative, very accusatory, judgmental word that I think it'd be best for us to go back to the act itself, as you have, and use the word authorized and unauthorized. I know I usually do that in my own language, and whenever I can, I correct people. And I also correct them when they use the word alien, because to me, the only aliens that there are the ones that we haven't really discovered in Mars. So again, I think words do matter, and they matter more when they're negative, dehumanizing, and cruel. And I think that's what these words do. So thank you for bringing this rule change forward. I plan to vote for it, and I hope all my colleagues do the same.
Would the gentlewoman yield?
Sure, absolutely.
I understand the point you're making, and it's something that I think you and Mr. McClintock will have a discussion about.
We will.
But this rule change actually is not on that point.
Right.
And so I thank the gentlelady for yielding, and she yields back, and I understand.
Madam Chair. This Biggs.
Ms. Spart has asked to be
Okay.
recognized, and then we'll get to the next person. Ms. Spart is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Chairwoman. I move to strike the last word. And I kind of want to agree with Representative Bach. And my, English is not my first language, and you can tell that I speak with a Yankee accent from Indiana. I always joke about that. But I kind of read in the definitions, and generally, and I'm not an attorney, so you guys attorney makes things complicated. But if I look in the simple words, and if I look at definition, illegal means anything illegal if you break the law. Anything authorized or unauthorized, if you have a license that you maybe don't have it at the time, that it presumes that the license could have been given. So it seems to me that is much narrow. And as Congressman Buck suggested, if we really want to include and deal with the issue, which I'm glad we're dealing, because I actually believe we have to deal with the issue with immigration. So to properly include, we need the right people that break the law, and there are people that unauthorized because the license that was given expired. So it seems like if we use both of these words, for common sense person that is not an attorney, it's actually make more sense. And I would really appreciate if you highly consider what Congressman Buck suggested, using both words, and it will be more inclusive and more clear for regular public who we legislate for and need to understand our language, not for attorneys that is very complicated. So I would appreciate that consideration, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Who else wishes to be heard?
Ms. Biggs.
Mr. Biggs, you are recognized for 5 minutes to strike the last word.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will tell you that I understand, I think, what the chair is trying to do. She's trying to use a circular, a set, if I could put it that way, of unauthorized, and then within that set is a subset that has heretofore been defined as illegal. If I'm understanding what you're trying to do, Madam Chair. I wouldn't have said anything, but I just feel like I have to respond to something that was said earlier about this illegal alien. No person is illegal. That is not what is the essence of a person, of course. I mean, what we're talking about when we say somebody's an illegal alien, those are terms of art. You are an alien. I might be a legal alien. I lived in Japan for multiple years. I was a legal alien in Japan. Even Sting sings about legal alien. It's not meant to be derogatory. It is meant to be a legal term of art describing one's status. And so you can be a legal alien or an illegal alien. It doesn't mean anything more or less than what your status is. I've, as a guy who's practiced law for a long time, I can tell you, I'm always baffled by people who inure certain terms of art as if that is the essence of what somebody is. And in this instance, I don't think that's not what we're even discussing. And so I was kind of surprised it was brought up. And I just would say that I attach myself to the comments of the ranking member McClintock, but I just felt compelled to just mention, we're not talking about an individual's personality or their essence. We're talking about a legal status, which is what we get paid to do as Congress, and is what lawyers get paid to do, to understand those terms of art. And with that, I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Does any other person wish to be heard before we vote on the proposed amendment?
Madam Chairwoman.
Congressman Correa, move to strike the last word.
Mr. Correa, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I also want to echo the comments of my colleagues that I want to thank you for taking your time to read the whole code and figure out this whole mess, because we have an immigration code that's contradictory and many times doesn't make a lot of sense. And more importantly, it's a code that hasn't been updated in a very long time to really reflect who the United States is. And you're absolutely right on when you talk about the fact that you have unauthorized visa overstays that now make up 50% of the undocumented in this country are now overstays of authorized visas. So I'm glad you're going into this direction and changing the words as well as hopefully the laws to reflect who America truly is today. We're not Japan, because as we know, Japan is a different country than the United States. We're a country made of immigrants. We share two borders with Canada and Mexico, and that's part of our culture and our history. And the unauthorized, I think, is reflective of who we are and what the evolution is of our immigrants in this country. So thank you very much, and I am fully supportive, Madam Chair, of your changes. Thank you very much.
House seeks recognition.
Madam Chairwoman,
Who is that?
Chip Roy.
Mr. Roy, you are recognized to strike the last word for 5 minutes.
Move to strike the last word. I wasn't going to comment, but like my colleague from Arizona, Mr. Biggs, I do feel compelled, based on some of the words that I've heard from some of my colleagues, to acknowledge the fact that, particularly, someone who represents a district in Texas, my southwest part of my district is about 100 miles from the border. I can assure you that the people of Texas who have ranches, who have homes, that are dealing on a daily basis with the scourge of cartel-driven illegal traffic, that they would tell you that it is in fact illegal. And that, as Mr. Biggs said, this is not going to the essence of who anyone is. Texas has a proud history in our relationship with Mexico, but these are words, and at the end of the day, people back home wonder why we spend hours debating things like this. And we, rename the subcommittee, instead of pull out border security and call it immigration and citizenship, because, heaven forbid we talk about border security in the title of the subcommittee. So we can't have border security, because border security would mean that cartels aren't actually running our border. Border security would mean that immigrants aren't in stash houses right now in Laredo, Texas. Border security would mean that immigrants aren't being used for profit centers for cartels while we pretend in the false name of compassion that open borders is good for immigrants. It's not. This is all semantic BS and nonsense. We have real human beings, yes. Human beings used as profit centers for cartels while we play footsie with open borders like it's some sort of grand thing for compassion. And it's horrible. We have 100,000 people pouring across our border a month right now because this administration refuses to actually do its job to secure the border. And we're sitting around playing semantics about unauthorized and illegal. When people are in this country illegally, they're the product of illegal organizations moving fentanyl into our country, where we had almost 100,000 people die of overdoses between May of 19 and May of 20. And we're sitting here in a semantic infinite do loop. I don't know. The American people just wonder what we're doing up here. And I have to say, I agree. It is perfectly appropriate for members of Congress and people in law enforcement, as I was in the United States Attorney's Office, to recognize when someone is violating our laws and is present illegally in the United States of America, and what that means for Americans and for organizations that are profiting on moving them here illegally. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. If I may just clarify on the title of the subcommittee, it is the Committee on Homeland Security that actually has jurisdiction over the border itself, not the Judiciary Committee. The Judiciary Committee has jurisdiction over immigration law and policy. That is the origin of the title that is reflected. Are there other members that wish to be recognized, or may we vote on the proposed amendment?
Madam Speaker, I'd like to be recognized, please.
The gentlelady is recognized to strike the last word and be heard for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move to strike the last word. I'll be brief. Just to ensure that my colleague, all my colleagues understand, there's only one person on the subcommittee that actually lives, works, and represents the southern border, and a district on the southern border, not 100 miles from the southern border, not in the same state where there's a border. And that's me, Texas 16, El Paso. And thank you for clarifying that Homeland Security deals with those issues. We are here, and what began as, I think, a very reasonable request has somehow devolved into a campaign commercial or ad. I'd like to reiterate my support or state my support for the change, and we'll be voting in favor of it. You know, when you think of nomenclature, yes, words absolutely matter. We don't have to put the word illegal, for example, before jaywalking. And so I think this is a perfectly reasonable change. Support it, and I yield back.
Other members wishing to be heard on the amendment? Seeing none, I will just note that this discussion is obviously an indication that we will have spirited debate on substantive issues later in the Congress, but this is actually not that. And so I would ask for those who are in favor of the amendment to please unmute and indicate by saying aye.
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 And those who are opposed to the amendment, please unmute and say no.
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 In the opinion, well, since it's very difficult to discern who has prevailed on a WebEx, I'm going to ask the clerk to call the roll, please.
Madam Chair, is this I have a procedural question.
Is on the amendment? Yes.
It's on isn't it on the Republican amendment? I was trying to say no because I believe
yes, it's on the amendment, and I think that was confusing. So let's have the clerk call the roll. The vote is on Mr. McClintock's amendment to place as amended by Mr. Buck that would be unauthorized and illegal.
Thank you for the clarification. I was confused.
Thank you for asking.
Ms. Lofgren.
No.
Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jayapal.
No.
Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Correa.
No.
Mr. Correa votes no. Ms. Garcia.
No.
Ms. Garcia votes no. Ms. Escobar.
Thank you all for the clarification. I vote no.
Ms. Escobar votes no. Ms. Jackson Lee. Ms. Jackson Lee. Mr. Neguse.
Hello? No, I'm sorry.
Ms. Jackson Lee.
You're unmuted
Can
now.
you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay, no.
Ms. Jackson Lee votes no. Mr. Neguse. Ms. Scanlon.
Just a minute.
No.
Ms. Scanlon votes no. Mr. McClintock.
Aye.
Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Buck. Mr. Buck.
Mr. Buck needs to unmute.
Aye.
Mr. Buck votes aye. Mr. Biggs.
Aye.
Mr. Biggs votes aye. Mr. Tiffany.
Aye.
Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Mr. Roy. Mr. Roy, you might be on mute.
Needed. Sorry. Aye.
Mr. Roy votes aye. Ms. Sparts.
Part, yes.
Ms. Sparts
Clay.
votes yes.
The clerk will report.
Madam Chair, there are 6 ayes and 7 noes.
And the amendment is not agreed to. Are there additional amendments? Hearing none, the question is on approving the rules. All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Opposed will say no. Hearing no noes, unless there is a request for a recorded vote, Mr. Chip, Mr. Roy, you're unmuted. Did you want a recorded vote?
I was still on mute. I'm sorry. I'm not sure why it's doing that.
Okay. So unless there is a request for a recorded vote, the rules of the committee are adopted by voice vote. And without objection, so ordered. The chair will now entertain a motion to request that DHS provide the subcommittee with reports on the beneficiaries of HR 187, HR 680, HR 739, and HR 785. I'd ask unanimous consent that my statement in favor of this report be added to the record. Each one of these bills was adopted by the committee unanimously in the last Congress and passed by the Congress, by the House of Representatives. Mr. McClintock, do you wish to be recognized for a statement or to put your statement in the record?
Yeah, Madam Chairman, I'm in agreement with you on these matters and just ask unanimous consent to place my statement of support in the record as well.
Are there any other members wishing to be heard on these en banc, this en banc motion? If not, then all in favor will say aye.
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 Opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. And we have now concluded the business section of this meeting, and we are ready to go into our hearing, which is titled The U.S. Immigration System, the Need for Bold Reforms, shortly. So there's no further business before the subcommittee meeting, and we will adjourn and reconvene for the purpose of this hearing. So the Subcommittee on Immigration and Citizenship will come to order, a quorum being present, and without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any time. We welcome everyone to this hearing, the U.S. Immigration System, the Need for Bold Reforms. As with our prior actual meeting, I'd like to remind members that we've established an email address and distribution list dedicated to circulating exhibits, motions, or other written material that members may want to offer as part of our hearing today. And if members would like to submit materials, please send them to the email address that has previously been distributed to your offices, and we will circulate the materials to members and staff as quickly as we can. As mentioned earlier, we have mask guidance, but since every member is participating in this hearing virtually, I will not read the mask guidance. Finally, I'd ask all members, both those to mute their microphones when they're not speaking. That will help us avoid unfortunate feedback. And I will now recognize myself for an opening statement. I'd like to welcome our witnesses and members of the Immigration and Citizenship Subcommittee to today's hearing on the need for bold reforms to the U.S. immigration system. I'd like to start today's hearing by looking back. One of the first hearings I chaired on behalf of the Immigration Subcommittee took place in March of 2007. The topic was the role of immigration in American society, and we convened that hearing on Ellis Island, a location that could not be more fitting or poignant. That day, we examined America's rich history by reflecting on personal stories of immigrants who were admitted to the United States through the island's Great Hall, many fleeing religious persecution and many others seeking the American dream. I shared the story of my grandfather, who more than 100 years ago boarded a ship from Sweden and landed in Boston. He had no money and he spoke no English, but he had fearless optimism and big dreams. While fearlessness, optimism, and the audacity to dream continues to drive people to our shores today, so too does fear of persecution. In that respect, little has changed from the Ellis Island era, and today, when it comes to immigration reform, we remain confronted with many of the same challenges and questions that we faced in 2007. With an estimated 11 million undocumented immigrants currently living in the United States, and a legal immigration system that has not been meaningfully updated in over 30 years, and I would add really maintains the same framework that we devised in 1965. Excuse me, our immigration laws are in need of reform. So far, Congress has been unable to rise to the moment, but I remain hopeful that this Congress will finally get something done. In 2019, the House passed two significant immigration reforms on a bipartisan basis: the American Dream and Promise Act and the Farm Workforce Modernization Act. We intend to once again take up and pass these and other important bills. This Congress, we also have a president who's made it clear that immigration reform is a top priority for his administration. On his first day, President Biden announced an overview of his bold vision for immigration reform, the U.S. Citizenship Act. Although actual text has not yet been unveiled, the U.S. Citizenship Act would, among other things, provide an opportunity for undocumented individuals to apply for lawful status, modernize the immigration system by prioritizing family unity and economic growth, manage the border with smart investments, and borrowing heavily from legislation I authored last Congress to address the root causes of migration in our hemisphere and ensure that the United States remains a refuge for those fleeing persecution. Our immigration laws are complex and far-reaching, and with that in mind, there will certainly be issues that are not covered in the bill, but the framework alone serves as an important starting point for today's discussion. It is my hope that this hearing will create momentum for building a rational, reasonable, and workable 21st century immigration system that meets our nation's needs and prepares us for the future. And I look forward to our discussion today and to hearing from all our witnesses. It's now my pleasure to recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, for any opening statement that he may wish to provide. Mr. McClintock.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Before we took a wrecking ball to our economy last year, we were enjoying one of the greatest expansions of economic opportunity in our lifetimes. Unemployment was at its lowest level in 50 years. The poverty rate was at its lowest rate in 60 years. Wage growth was the strongest in 40 years. The wage gap was narrowing for the first time in many decades as blue-collar wages began to increase dramatically. The unemployment rate for women was the lowest in 70 years. For African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, veterans, disabled Americans, and those without a high school diploma, unemployment was the lowest ever recorded. The labor participation rate began to increase after years of decline as workers who'd given up hope of finding work began seizing opportunities. The participation rate for men between the ages of 25 and 34 grew for the first time since 1962. Now, big business and big agriculture hated this because it required them to pay higher wages. But in the growing economy that it produced, many more people were prospering than in many decades. Tax and regulatory relief obviously explain much of this success, but the extraordinary improvement of wages for unskilled and low-skilled workers begs for greater insight. Could it be that the Trump administration's success in restoring control of our borders stemmed the flood of low-wage labor into the job market that had been suppressing wages for American workers for decades? We'll soon find out the answer to that question. President Biden has signed several executive orders in the last few weeks that together are already producing a new migrant crisis on the southern border. Customs and Border Protection agents report that the daily flow on the southern border has nearly doubled from 2,000 last month to 3,500 this month. The number of illegal immigrants encountered on the southern border during the first 4 months of fiscal year 2020 was roughly 165,000. That number is nearly doubled for the first 4 months of fiscal 21 to 297,000. The effect of these executive orders includes abandoning the border wall, questioning the long-standing promise that immigrants should be able to support themselves, releasing illegal immigrants with minors into the interior, ending the Remain in Mexico policy for those claiming asylum in the United States after they've traveled through other countries where they could have sought it, granting what amounts to sanctuary status for a wide variety of criminal offenses, including drunk driving and sex offenses, and ordering ICE not to enforce immigration laws for 100 days, an order that had been stayed by the federal courts. Now, apparently, this isn't bold enough for the open borders left, and it's seeking even bolder actions, and I'm sure we'll get a glimpse of that today. But every American needs to fully understand the implications of these policies to their own futures. We're not going to enforce our immigration laws, and our borders mean nothing. And if our borders mean nothing, we're no longer a country. We're just a vast international territory between Canada and Mexico, both of which, by the way, have immigration laws that they actually enforce. But I hope my Democratic colleagues will take the time to answer some basic questions that the American people have a right to know. How are American workers helped by flooding the labor market with another wave of illegal immigration? How are our children who've been robbed of an entire year of educations helped by filling their classrooms with non-English speaking classmates? How are our streets made safer by allowing aliens who drive drunk to remain on our roads rather than be arrested and placed in removal proceedings? How is our nation made safer by reopening virtually unrestricted travel with hotbeds of international terrorism? How are our communities made safer by making it harder to deport criminal illegal aliens and gang members? How are our hospitals made more accessible by overwhelming emergency rooms with illegal immigrants demanding care? If you're going to advocate for these policies, you have an obligation to answer these questions. But I want to conclude on a hopeful note. If the majority wants to make progress this session, there's not only room for compromise, there's a necessity for it. We do need to provide legal status to children brought here illegally who've grown up here and have no memory of their home country. And we need to reform our temporary agricultural worker program. But we cannot address these issues until we secure our borders and enforce our immigration laws. Otherwise, we just invite a new wave of illegal immigration, just like we're seeing right now. So if you want to make progress, the minority is anxious to start down this road. I thank you very much, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chairman of the full committee, Mr. Nadler, is recognized if he would like to offer an opening statement.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. Although we have many legislative priorities as Congress, immigration reform is one of the most pressing and complex. The damage inflicted on our immigration system over the last 4 years has generated a renewed sense of urgency around the need to enact protections for the undocumented and other critical measures. Not only must we get immigration reform done soon, we must get it right. Our approach to immigration will shape our future and define who we are as a society. Will we thank the honest, hardworking people who have served our nation as essential workers during the COVID pandemic by providing them with the opportunity to obtain lawful status? Will we ease restrictions from the 1996 laws and allow families to be reunited and remain together lawfully? Will we choose an approach that welcomes talented STEM professionals, academics, and others from around the world to strengthen our economy and increase our global competitiveness? And will we finally allow young people who have grown up in this country without lawful status a full opportunity to pursue the American dream? Fortunately, we now have a president who believes the answer to these questions should be yes. I applaud President Biden for his bold vision for immigration reform and for making it a top priority for his administration. The benefits of immigration are clear. Immigrants are our friends and neighbors. They enrich our society, our culture, and our economy. Just like U.S. citizens, they pay taxes, work, and support local businesses. It is estimated that the 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States pay nearly $12 billion annually in state and local taxes. This number would only grow if they were provided with a chance to obtain legal status. The important role that immigrants play in keeping our country running has also been laid bare by the COVID-19 pandemic. It is estimated that 3 in 4 undocumented workers are engaged in work that is deemed essential by the Department of Homeland Security. Further, as more and more baby boomers leave the workforce, immigration will play a key role in sustaining our current workforce levels. To maintain and strengthen our position as a leader among developed countries, immigration reform must be part of our overall strategy for economic growth. Last Congress, the House passed several significant pieces of immigration reform legislation. These include the American Dream and Promise Act and the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, which collectively would provide legal status to an estimated 3.5 to 4 million undocumented immigrants. We also passed other bills that are smaller in size but significant in impact. For example, we passed the No Ban Act, which prohibits discrimination based on religion in our immigration system and prevents executive overreach in suspending the admission of immigrants. We also passed the Access to Counsel Act, which would provide important protections at ports of entry to individuals seeking admission by ensuring they have the ability to consult with counsel or other interested parties if they are subjected to prolonged inspection. It is incumbent upon us to pass these and other measures as soon as possible and to build upon these successes to improve our immigration system to the benefit of our country. I want to thank the chair, Ms. Lofgren, for holding this valuable hearing. And I thank all of today's witnesses, especially my constituent, Professor Hunt, for participating in this important discussion. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. I do not believe that Mr. Jordan is yet with us. If he is able to come later, he will, of course, be recognized if he wishes to provide an opening statement. With that, all other opening statements by unanimous consent will be made part of the record. And it is now my pleasure to introduce the witnesses that we have here today. First, we Mary Elena Incapi. I probably mispronounced her name. She is the executive director of the National Immigration Law Center and the National Immigration Law Center Immigration Justice Fund. She began her tenure at NILC in 2000 as a staff attorney leading the organization's labor and employment rights program. During that time, she successfully litigated law reform and impact litigation cases dealing with the intersection of immigration and employment law. She then served as the NILC's director of programs from 2004 to 2008, after which she became executive director. She immigrated to the United States from Colombia as a child. She earned her Juris Doctor degree from Northeastern University School of Law. Next, we have Jennifer Hunt, who is a professor of economics at Rutgers University. From 2013 to 2015, while on leave from Rutgers, she served as the chief economist for the U.S. Department of Labor and later as deputy assistant director for microeconomic analysis at the U.S. Department of the Treasury. She is a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and a research fellow at the Center for Economic Policy Research in London. Her current research focuses on immigration and wage inequality. She received her PhD in economics from Harvard and her bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Next, we have John Lettieri. He is president and CEO of the Economic Innovation Group, EIG. Prior to this, he was vice president of public policy and government affairs for the Organization for International Investment. He has also previously served as the foreign policy aide to U.S. Senator Chuck Hagel, who was then a senior member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. His commentary and research have been cited in dozens of publications, including the Associated Press, Wall Street Journal, and Washington Post. Mr. Lettieri is a graduate of Wake Forest University, where he studied political science and global commerce. And finally, but not least, Peter N. Kirsanov is a member of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. He was first appointed to the commission in 2001 and was reappointed in 2007, 2013, and 2019. He is a partner at the Cleveland, Ohio law firm of Benisech, Friedlander, Copeland, and Aronoff, LLP, in the Labor and Employment Practice Group. Mr. Kirsanov is also a former member of the National Labor Relations Board. He received his bachelor's in 1976 from Cornell and his JD with honors in 1979 from Cleveland State University. We welcome all of our distinguished witnesses and thank them for participating in today's hearing. I'll begin by swearing in all of our witnesses, all of whom are testifying remotely. I would ask that each of you turn on your audio and make sure we can see your face and your raised right hand while I administer the oath. All right. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God?
I do.
Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. First, let me note that your written statements will be entered into the record in their entirety. Accordingly, I will ask that you summarize your testimony in about 5 minutes. And to help stay within that time limit, there's a timer on your screen, or there should be, to help you keep track of the time. So we'll begin with Ms. Incapija, and you will mention your name so I can pronounce it properly in the future. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. It is Maria Elena Incapie. So thank you, Committee Chair Nadler, Subcommittee Chair Lofgren, Ranking Member McClintock, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I am here today because my parents, Arturo and Teresa, moved from Colombia to work in Rhode Island's textile factories to give their 10 children better opportunities. Today, my family includes educators, health professionals, entrepreneurs, emerging leaders in finance, climate, engineering fields, and students. I'm a naturalized citizen, a lawyer, and the executive director of the National Immigration Law Center. We believe that all of us, regardless of where we were born, how much money we have, or the color of our skin, should have the freedom to thrive. We are at a pivotal moment in this nation. A historic number of voters, ranging from Black women to naturalized citizens, voted for a president who would unify our nation and reclaim the United States' position as a beacon of hope. They voted for an economy that gives everyone, including immigrants, a fair shot. And they voted with increasing recognition that immigrants are keeping our country running through the pandemic and doing their part to keep our loved ones and healthy cared for. We are at the beginning of a new era. Together with the combined efforts of the Biden administration and congressional leadership, we must deliver on the promise that our nation has held for previous generations. We must recognize immigrants are essential. The Biden administration and Congress should know that including immigrants in building a better future is not only morally and economically sound, but also carries strong bipartisan support from voters across the political spectrum. Today, we will focus on the need for bold reforms. But first, I'll share a few stories of the people whose lives and humanity make them essential to our country. Take Dr. Abudu from Ghana, who works as an emergency room physician in California. He came to the US as a teenager and is saving lives every day. He says that working in healthcare during the pandemic is hell, and it is heartbreaking. Last month, one of his coworkers, also a physician, died of COVID. Yet Dr. Abudu shows up for work, risking his own life to save others. Catherine Ofa-Man from Tonga is educating Pacific Islander communities about COVID and working to reduce transmission rates while encouraging those who need it to seek care despite their fear. In her words, they take care of their own because they heard that people go to the hospital and die. Saul Sanchez from Mexico lived in Colorado and proudly worked at a meat processing plant for years to provide for his family. Mr. Sanchez was hospitalized in the very hospital his daughter works as a nurse. He died from COVID. His family was unable to tell him that they loved him before he took his final breath. Like them, there are millions more who you will impact through your actions. The status quo is simply not acceptable. We are in the third decade of the 21st century, yet we're still stuck in a 1980s immigration system. We must find a new way forward. We need a 21st century immigration system and policies that begin to address the root causes so that people have the freedom to remain in their home country. And we must create legal channels for people to move to the US to be reunited with loved ones, pursue an education or employment opportunities. Our immigration system must advance racial, economic, and gender justice, equity, and inclusion. It's time to end the dynamic of having immigration status function as the gatekeeper to accessing basic necessities and rights for all. We applaud President Biden's vision set forth in the U.S. Citizenship Act. We call on congressional leadership and members of this subcommittee to support the swift passage of bold, inclusive bills that will provide a pathway to citizenship without punitive provisions. Congress must also recognize the essential workers who are critical to our recovery and place them on a fast track to citizenship. The urgency is clear. Each day without legislative solutions causes suffering, not only for immigrants, but also for their US citizen loved ones, employers, schools, local communities, and to our country. Today's immigrants are simply seeking the same opportunities that generations of immigrants like my parents and many of your families and ancestors have had before them, the chance to build a better future. This is a time for moral imagination and leadership as we work to safeguard and strengthen our democracy, heal from racial inequalities and injustices, and recover from this global pandemic that has reminded us how interdependent we all are. The time is now. Immigrants are essential for the soul of America, and so we must act boldly together to make good on the promise of America. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The gentlelady's time has expired, and now we'll hear from Professor Hunt for about 5 minutes. You're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Nadler. Thank you, Chair Lofgren and Ranking Member McClintock. My name is Jennifer Hunt. I'm a professor of economics at Rutgers University, where I study the economics of immigration. There's a remarkable amount of agreement among economists as to the impact of immigration on the economy. And this is reflected in a 2017 consensus report written by a panel convened by the National Academy of Sciences. I was a member of that committee, and in my testimony today, I'm mostly going to summarize the main results of that report, and while also pointing out an area which lacked consensus. So let me begin with the impact of immigration on the economy as a whole. When immigrants arrive in the United States, they increase the labor force, thus causing more goods and services to be produced, which is the same thing as saying that gross domestic product or GDP rises. But more subtly, immigration also increases GDP per capita and GDP per native-born American. One reason for this is that immigration allows greater specialization. So immigrants come with slightly different skills from native-born workers, and this allows those native-born workers to specialize more in the things that they're best at, which raises their productivity. Now, this increased specialization comes about whether the immigrants differ from the native-born by having higher skills or by having lower skills than native-born workers. Another impact of immigration on the economy as a whole is to increase growth in GDP per capita. And this comes about because immigrants innovate more than native-born Americans. Turning to the labor market, the report found that immigration has no effect on the employment rate of native-born Americans and no effect on average wages of native-born workers. However, immigration does have an effect on the distribution of wages. Immigration tends to increase the wages of native-born workers who collaborate with immigrants in tasks at work, and tends to reduce the wages of those native-born workers whose skills are very similar to those of immigrants, in particular native-born high school dropouts. Now let me consider the fiscal impact of immigration. The report found that both native-born Americans and immigrants are net beneficiaries of the government because the government runs a budget deficit. And by government here, I mean collectively state, local, and federal governments. It is the case that immigrants are greater net beneficiaries of the government than are native-born Americans. The main reason for this is that immigrants have more children and therefore use more public schooling services. And the report noted that this could be considered an investment rather than a cost. Immigrants are net contributors to the federal government while being net beneficiaries of state and local governments, in part because of their greater use of public schooling, as I mentioned, and in part because state governments have tax schedules that are less progressive than those of the federal government. Now, consensus was lacking on the degree to which immigration reduces the wages of native-born high school dropouts. My own assessment of the literature is that the effect is small, but even a small effect is a cause for concern because the biggest problem of the US labor market over the last decades has been a lack of wage growth for immigrant workers. So policies to raise low wages must be a priority, but immigration should not be one of the tools used for this end due to its great benefits to the economy overall. Thank you very much.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Lofgren, Ranking Member McClintock, and members of the subcommittee. Thanks for the opportunity to testify today. My name is John Lettieri, and I'm the President and CEO of the Economic Innovation Group. EIG is a bipartisan research and policy organization devoted to building a more dynamic and inclusive American economy. The United States is a magnet for skilled and entrepreneurial people the world over. In dozens of fields, immigrants have fueled American dynamism and helped keep our country young, innovative, and aspirational. But current skilled immigration policy fails on multiple fronts. It welcomes far too few workers, it fails to prioritize entrepreneurs, and it primarily serves to strengthen already successful and fast-growing areas of the country. My testimony today will focus on 2 ways that immigration reform could deliver meaningful benefits to a broader share of workers and communities. First, by supporting the development of economically and demographically stagnant places, and second, by bolstering American entrepreneurship and innovation. I'll start by talking about how to better serve struggling communities. For most of its history, the United States enjoyed the advantages of a young and quickly growing population. However, the picture has changed dramatically in the past decade, leaving us with a slowly growing, rapidly aging society. The latest census estimates reveal that the U.S. has reached an unprecedented level of demographic stagnation, with some of the lowest growth rates recorded in the country's history. The effects of this seismic shift are felt unevenly across regions and communities. Today, fully 81% of counties have seen their prime working age populations shrink over the past decade, hitting rural areas and legacy cities the hardest. The consequences of such steep demographic decline are only just beginning to take shape throughout the economy. So what can be done in response? Alongside policies that make it easier to start and support a family, immigration policy is one of the few and most obvious ways to counter demographic decline. Immigrants, skilled immigrants in particular, bring an array of benefits to struggling communities. They fill empty housing stock and bring new life to blighted neighborhoods. Where there's a shrinking tax base, they bring fiscal stability for schools and first responders. Where there's a dwindling local workforce, immigrants enable employers to expand. And where there's shuttered storefronts, immigrants start new businesses and add vibrancy to local commerce. Unfortunately, current policy does little to connect skilled immigrants with the kind of legacy cities, small towns, and rural areas that could benefit most from their presence. To fix this, EIG has called for a geographically targeted visa program, a Heartland visa, aimed at helping struggling areas break the cycle of economic and demographic decline. Such a program would open a new door for skilled workers who meet a range of needs, helping to grow a local robotics hub or fill a small town physician shortage, for example. Instead of relying on employer sponsorship, the Heartland visas would be tied to communities, ones that qualify based on local workforce and other criteria. To participate, eligible communities would be required to opt in and commit resources matched by federal dollars to supporting new arrivals. Welcoming communities would rally to attract new arrivals, much as they do for a new corporate headquarters, by showcasing their local amenities, quality of life, job opportunities, and growth potential. Visa holders, in turn, would commit to settle in eligible communities for a set period, say 3 years, in exchange for being fast-tracked for a green card and permanent status. They would have a wide array of choices for where to settle and full job mobility within their chosen labor markets. Such a policy would reject the false choice between compassion and self-interest by aligning the needs of struggling areas with the aspirations of those looking to build a better life in our country. The second area of focus for my testimony deals with how immigration reform can support American entrepreneurship. New businesses are major drivers of job creation, accounting for the majority of net new jobs each year. They are a vital source of competition and increased demand for American workers. Immigrants bolster entrepreneurship in 2 important ways. First, as noted earlier, they help to counter population loss, which is shown to hamper business formation. And second, immigrants themselves are disproportionately likely to become entrepreneurs. Roughly 1 in 4 U.S. entrepreneurs is an immigrant, and research finds that immigrants are nearly twice as likely to start a business as native-born Americans. The overwhelming evidence suggests that we should be doing much more to boost inflows of skilled immigrants in general and skilled immigrant entrepreneurs in particular. The U.S. should establish a new program to provide visas for immigrant entrepreneurs, much in the same way that other advanced economies have already done. In fact, more than 24 other countries have some form of a startup visa to welcome the kind of talent the U.S. routinely turns away. Based on everything we know about the impact of skilled immigration, there is little doubt that a robust startup visa program would lead to a wealth of job creation and strengthen the innovation-intensive sectors of our economy. It's to our great advantage that people around the world see the United States as a beacon of opportunity, but we have simply failed to apply this advantage to solving many of our most deep-seated economic challenges. So as this committee considers ways to reform and improve immigration policy, I urge you to prioritize establishing new programs that support the economic needs of struggling communities and bolster American entrepreneurship. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. And now we will hear from our final witness, Mr. Peter Kirsanow.
Thank you, Madam Chair Lofgren, Ranking Member McClintock, members of the committee. I am Peter Kirsanow, member of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and a member of the Labor and Employment Practice Group of Benish Friedlander. I'm here in my personal capacity. The U.S. Commission on Civil Rights was established pursuant to the 1957 Civil Rights Act to, among other things, examine matters related to discrimination and denials of equal protection. And because immigration and national origin implicate issues related to race discrimination, the Commission has conducted several hearings over the years related to various aspects of immigration, particularly illegal immigration. Among the recent hearings were two that addressed the effect of illegal immigration on the wages and employment opportunities of Black Americans. The evidence adduced by the Commission shows that illegal immigration has a disproportionately negative effect on the wages and employment opportunities of Blacks, particularly Black males. It's important to note that the witnesses at the hearing span the ideological spectrum, and while they may have differed with respect to certain opinions, each and every witness agreed that illegal immigration has a demonstrably negative effect on Black employment rates. The evidence adduced at the Commission shows that the reason illegal immigration hurts Blacks is pretty basic. Blacks, particularly Black men, are disproportionately concentrated in the low-skill labor market and are disproportionately likely to have no more than a high school diploma. And likewise, illegal immigrants are disproportionately low-skilled and also disproportionately likely to have minimal educational levels. Both of these groups compete against one another in the low-skilled labor market, and the competition is often most fierce in those very industries in which Blacks have traditionally been highly concentrated, such as construction, hospitality, and service. And Blacks frequently lose out in that competition, crowded out by illegal immigrants who are preferred by some employers for a variety of reasons. As one of the witnesses in one of our hearings said, Professor Vernon Briggs of Cornell's Industrial Labor Relations School, this isn't because low-skilled Americans, regardless of race, are unwilling to work. It's that they're less willing to work for the cut rate wages and sometimes substandard conditions that are often proffered to illegal immigrants, which is a cohort highly unlikely to complain to the EEOC, OSHA, or the Wage and Hour Division of the Department of Labor. The competition is often most pronounced in major metropolitan areas, New York, Chicago, LA, but also more increasingly in southeastern states such as Virginia, North Carolina, and Georgia. The impact of illegal immigration on the wage and employment levels of low-skilled workers is especially severe in today's pandemic. At the time of the Commission's hearings, on average, the unemployment rate for Blacks without a high school diploma was around 12%. However, before the pandemic, Black unemployment dropped to a record low 5.5%. Today, that rate's nearly doubled. Obviously, the supply of low-skilled workers far exceeds the demand. This bodes ill for all such workers, but particularly Black males. As President Biden noted in the last few days, quote, "We saw the jobs report. Only 6,000 private sector jobs will be created, and at that rate, it's going to take years before we get to full employment," end quote. Research shows that 40% of the 18-point decline in labor participation rates among Blacks over the last several decades is attributable to immigration. That's hundreds of thousands of Blacks without jobs. The evidence adduced at the commission also shows that illegal immigration depresses wage rates for the available jobs. As the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta estimated, as the result of the growth in undocumented workers over the last couple of decades, the annual earnings of the average documented worker in Georgia in 2007 were $960 lower than they were in 2000. And in leisure and hospitality industries, they were $1,520 lower. And recent history shows that lax border enforcement results in a further influx of illegal immigrants who will further crowd out Blacks and other low-skilled Americans from the workforce. This inexorably increases the number of Blacks dependent on the government for subsistence, and it swells the ranks of unemployed Blacks while reducing the wages of Blacks who do have jobs. It's respectfully submitted that before the federal government decides to relax immigration enforcement or grant legal status to illegal immigrants, serious deliberation be given to the effect such grants will have on the wage and employment levels of low-skilled Americans generally, Blacks specifically. The evidence adduced at the hearings of the Civil Rights Commission showed that granting such legal status is not without profound and substantial costs to American workers. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, sir. And thanks to all of the witnesses for their testimony today. Now is the time when members of the subcommittee can ask questions under the 5-minute rule. I'd like to recognize first the ranking member, Mr. McClintock, for any questions that he may have. Mr. McClintock.
Well, thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Kirsenow, we have testimony that seems to blur the distinction between macro and microeconomics. From a macroeconomic standpoint, the economy as a whole, the biggest driver of economic growth is population. But from a microeconomic standpoint, how it affects an individual in that economy, it's entirely different. If we flood the market with unskilled or low-skilled labor, the overall economy will grow, the rich will get richer as wages are suppressed, but they'll do that at the expense of unskilled or low-skilled laborers whose wages are being suppressed. Could you elaborate on that?
Sure. What we have here, it's important to disaggregate the various components of the labor market. As you indicated, there are certain parts of the labor market that benefit from, and it's mainly legal immigration, but there's a devastating effect at the lower strata among people who are earning minimum wage jobs or just above minimum wage jobs from especially illegal immigration for the reasons I just mentioned. This is especially true right now. This couldn't be the vortex of improbabilities in terms of trying to pass some type of immigration that relaxes immigration laws, at least among low-skilled labor. This is couldn't be the worst time because of the pandemic. And off in the horizon is the prospect of a $15 minimum wage that does two things. One is it's a magnet for even a greater influx of illegal immigrants, because we've seen that every time the minimum wage goes up, there's a greater influx of illegal immigrants. But number two is that it's going to cause a greater amount of competition between the two cohorts of legal immigrants and low-skilled Americans. And again, as I said before, it's not just Black Americans, it's all Americans, but it happens to be that Black Americans are particularly concentrated in a certain area. There's been a study done with respect to EEOC charges over the years. And if you take a look at some of these EEOC charges, they're quite alarming, where a number of American companies or employers specifically discriminate in overt ways against Americans, but particularly Black Americans, in favor of illegal immigrants, such as tendering only job applicant information in Spanish. On one occasion, they said, "You Blacks get out here and goodbye," and then brought in illegal immigrants. Those specific words were said. So this is not something that's speculative. It happens, and it's going to happen at a much greater level in this present atmosphere of pandemic, unemployment, and prospect that everyone's aware of across the world, that the minimum wage is going to go up.
Now, you requested us from the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights relating to the displacement of jobs for Black workers.
Tom, you have frozen. Okay, your Wi-Fi
Back?
froze for a minute. You're back.
Okay, very good. Mr. Kirsten, I was asking about a study you requested from the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights relating to the displacement of jobs for Black workers, particularly Black males, caused by illegal immigration. At the conclusion of that study, how many fewer jobs for Black Americans came as a result of competition from illegal immigrants?
I don't recall specifically. I'd have to refer to the study itself, but we're talking about over a course of a 30-year period, about 1.8 million jobs, I believe. Every year it fluctuates because of the vagaries of the economy, whether it be minimum wage, whether it be the GDP, all host of issues, but it is a substantial number. In my day job for the last 42 years, I've been a labor and employment lawyer. I see this visually every day, dealing with minority contractors who can't bid on jobs successfully because they're employing legal workers that they have to pay minimum wage or above to, and their competition is employing illegal immigrants and they underbid them. So this is a discrete and powerful problem here in the Black community.
Now, you mentioned that Black employment levels declined alarmingly in the 3 decades prior to the Trump administration, 18 points, I think. And you mentioned estimates of 40% of that decline to competition from illegal immigrants. You mentioned that the evidence shows that illegal immigration depressed wage levels by between $960 and $1,500 annually. Mr. Kirsten, is this discrepancy because low-skilled Americans are unwilling to work?
No, not at all. As I indicated in my testimony, we've had witnesses, including, as I said, Professor Briggs, who said there's a lot of reasons why some employers prefer illegal immigrants. One is a lot of illegal immigrants are phenomenally good workers. Number two is, however, that they can pay them less. They don't have to abide by many of the regulations and statutes governing employment. They are less likely to join unions. There's a whole host of issues. And as I stated in my statement, it's not very common that you find illegal immigrants filing charges with the Wage and Hour Division of the Department of Labor. They're not going to do that. They're not going to be filing charges with any other alphabet agency. And that's an attractive feature for some employers.
Thank you.
Does the gentleman yield back?
I believe I'm over time.
All right.
So yield back whatever my deficit is.
Okay. I now would recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Nadler, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Professor Hunt, I want to thank you again for taking the time to testify at our hearing today and lending your expertise to the discussion. As a professor of economics, you have extensively studied the impact of immigration on the economy and have concluded that it has a net positive effect. In addition, you testified that despite the common perception that immigration has a negative impact on native-born employment and wages, your research concluded otherwise. Can you elaborate on your findings, and specifically, can you provide some specific examples of how so-called low-skilled immigrants benefit the economy?
Indeed, thank you very much. And on this matter, I can again report on the consensus views of the National Academy report. So one might expect that that immigration would either lower employment rates or would lower wages. It could be one or the other. So if there is no evidence of lower employment rates, it may seem as a surprise, come as a surprise to many that the consensus is no effect on average wages. But there are various mechanisms that can lead to this outcome. And one I mentioned, it's the ability of native-born workers to specialize more than before when immigrants arrive. So the evidence shows that native-born workers tend to move to jobs that use communications and English language more intensively. Now, another factor is that firms can choose which technology to use in their production, and they choose it as a function of the composition of the workforce. And so, for example, if there is an arrival of a large number of unskilled immigrants, then what the employers do is adopt a more labor-intensive technology, which can then absorb those additional lower skilled workers without negative effects on the incumbent workers. Another factor is, as I mentioned, that there are offsetting effects of the arrival of immigrants in general. So while we expect them to lower the wages of native-born workers who have extremely similar skills, they're likely to raise the wages of other workers with whom they have complementary tasks. And now, more specifics on the contributions of the less skilled immigrants, in addition to this specialization that I mentioned, they perform services that benefit native-born workers. And so one that has been well documented, for example, is that they lower the cost of childcare, which has led to increased labor force participation on the behalf of on the part of native-born women. I'll use another example. If we think about agriculture, immigrants with lower skills also contribute a lot to this sector. And in this sector, the choice really is between employing less skilled immigrants or having increased mechanization of agriculture. There really is no displacement here of native-born workers, so it simply benefits consumers of agricultural products. And all of these, yes.
Well, I just said, I want to ask some other questions, so you can wrap up.
Actually, I'd finished.
Well, thank you. Ms. Hincape, let me turn to you. It's clear that if the 11 million undocumented individuals in the United States were given a chance to obtain legal status and apply for citizenship, their lives would change immeasurably. You've spent more than 2 decades defending and advancing the rights of immigrants. In your view, what are the most significant impacts on an individual level that would result from legal status?
Thank you, Chairman Adler. So yes, I think there are a couple of things. One is we've seen this, for example, with the DACA program and the success over the last 8 years of young immigrants being able to get legal status. It increased wages. They were able to purchase homes. They were able to purchase cars. They were able to take care of their families, and most importantly, to pursue their dreams, higher education. Many of them started businesses, and many of them are working as essential workers, including in the healthcare industry. And so we see that that immediate benefit, not just to them and their families, but also to their employers and their local communities. And Chairman Adler, I would take this moment to also talk about the conversation that just took place with respect to wages, particularly in the low wage context, which is the fact is that low wage workers, immigrants, so first there is a recognition that among the immigrants, many of them are Black immigrants, and they are experiencing record levels of racial discrimination in the workplace as well, and the diversity of communities that we have. Second is that the solution to the points that Mr. Kirsaner was raising, which I completely agree with in terms of the fact that many undocumented workers aren't coming forward to complain about wages, et cetera. The solution lies actually in making sure that we have robust labor and employment law enforcement, right? Pitting groups of low-wage workers against one another seems like a vehicle really that is used by forces that are intent on keeping wages low and workers divided amongst themselves. You know, the fact is that undocumented workers are not the ones who are depressing wages or working conditions. It's the employers that are knowingly hiring them and knowing that they can do so with impunity, or at least they think that they can do so. And so for making sure that, you know, the answer one is legalization, making sure that undocumented workers are finally put on a path to citizenship. Second, that we reallocate resources from detention and deportation to robust labor and employment law enforcement so that those abusive employers cannot have an unfair economic advantage against the employers that are actually playing by the rules. And then
The gentleman's time has expired. We turn now to Mr. Buck, who is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair, and I just want to make sure that I mention how proud I was to work with the chair for the last 2 years as the ranking member, and really felt like this was one of the subcommittees that really seeks common ground in a very difficult area. And I thank you, and I look forward to working with Mr. McClintock and you and that common ground. There are obviously going to be areas in immigration where we disagree, and we have strong feelings, but hopefully we continue to find that common ground. I want to just mention one thing that happened in my hometown, and I want to give Mr. McClintock the rest of my time and really address this to Mr. Kurthenau. But the question, one of the employers in my hometown in the 1990s transitioned from American workers to undocumented, unauthorized, illegal, choose your term. I would suggest that Mr. Nadler turn off his video before he undresses. Great. The effect on the town of probably 70,000 to 100,000 people was that the wages at this particular plant went from $18 an hour to $14 an hour. The school district had 35% monolingual Spanish K through 5 students. The hospital emergency room, the plant actually told their employees, gave them a statement in Spanish telling their employees that the emergency room was their primary care facility. The effect on the judicial system, there were all kinds of effects from this form of immigration. And I just want to ask Mr. Kurthenau if you could sort of talk about that a little bit, and then I want to yield to Mr. McClintock.
Thank you. Yeah, my comments were generally directed toward employment because we had done some studies of that, the Civil Rights Commission, but there are a host of adverse effects to having a broad population of illegal immigrants, one of which is the crime rates. And I know there's a dispute as to this, but we took a look at some numbers. We did some studies with respect to crime rates. I'm not talking about all immigrants. We're talking about the cohort of illegal immigrants, and especially male illegal immigrants. And when you take a look at, I think it may be in some of my material, but if you take a look at some of the largest states in the United States, by the way, this is difficult to ascertain because the federal government doesn't keep specific stats on the type of crimes or the number of crimes committed by illegal immigrants. You've got to look to state data and then cross-tab it with some federal data and prison data. But on average, it appears in some states, for example, California, when you're taking a look at homicide rates, that illegal immigrants are up to 3 times more likely to commit murder than lawful residents. When you're talking about sex offenses, I think the level is 3 times as great. Also, kidnapping is 4 times as great. But there's a whole host of categories where the amount of crime attributable to illegal aliens far exceeds that of lawfully present Americans. So that's one aspect of it. The effect on the public fisc is also significant. There's at least one study, and again, there are competing studies on this, but the significance of this is there are competing studies, and at least this is something that needs to be studied even more directly. But the effect with respect to the placement of charges upon the public fisc with respect to medical care, emergency room care, the school districts, of a whole host of public services is greater, the greater amount of illegal immigrants in that particular area. Labor policies.
I want to give time to Mr. McClintock if I can, but thank you very much for your response. I appreciate that. Mr. McClintock, I yield to you the remainder of my time. Maybe not. Is he muted?
You only have
There we go.
36 seconds left.
Appreciate that. Mr. Now you mentioned the effect of illegal immigration on the prosperity of African Americans, but doesn't it have the same effect of every race, of the unskilled and low-skilled market in every race, including legal immigrants who are trying to get into the job market?
It does. It has an adverse effect on lawfully present Hispanics, Asians, whites, blacks. It doesn't discriminate on the basis of race. What it does do though, is have a more pronounced effect on Black Americans, only because that cohort is far more likely to have the same type of skill sets or lack of skill sets and educational levels or lack thereof as illegal immigrants. So this is something that's, it's a panopticon. It affects everyone but blacks more readily. And then I think I'd have to take a look at my data again, but I think the second most affected are lawfully present Hispanic workers, because they are second most likely to be.
The gentleman's time has expired. We appreciate that. And I'd now like to recognize the gentlelady from Washington for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It occurs to me as I listen to this discussion that what we should really do is pass a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants, level the playing field, and how about we invest in education for all of our American citizens, Black, Latino, and every Asian American and white, and then it seems like we would be in a much better place. Madam Chair, I am a proud immigrant to this country, sent here by my parents, by myself when I was 16 years old, and naturalized after 17 long years. I believe strongly that immigrants are a crucial part of our nation, working on the front lines of COVID-19, contributing their skills and talents to their communities every single day. The fact that nearly a quarter of the immigrant population in the United States is undocumented is a failure of our system, and frankly of Congress, to provide legal avenues for essential parts of our communities. I want to focus today on the fact that immigration law today provides only one consequence for a violation, and that is deportation. A parent who steals baby formula because she or he can't afford it may be deportable with no judicial discretion. There is no chance for people to rectify their situation or alternative options that meet the scale of the infraction. So, Ms. Capier, thank you for your work. I want to root my questions, and I have several of them for you, in the story of Manny Uch, a Cambodian refugee from my state who escaped with his mother from the Khmer Rouge and made it to the United States at the age of 8. Manny grew up in a low-income neighborhood with few resources or supports, and like many teens in his situation, got involved with drugs and gangs as a teenager. At 18, he was caught driving the getaway car during a robbery and spent 3 years in prison. What would be the consequences for a refugee or any kind of immigrant who was charged with a crime like Mr. Uch?
Yeah, thank you for your leadership, Representative Jayapal. Our immigration system generally takes a one-size-fits-all approach to punishment. There's no proportionality, as you mentioned. It doesn't matter what the crime is. So someone in Manny's situation would almost certainly be subject to detention without a bond, and in some cases, prolonged detention and eventually deportation. They most likely would never get a chance to even to present their case before an immigration judge.
Now, Mr. Uch was actually not deported at the time, thanks to tremendous community outpouring of support for him and a Republican district attorney that helped. And once he was released back into his community to be married, once he was released back into his community, he married, became a father to U.S. citizen children, started a Little League team, and opened a youth center to help kids like him stay out of trouble. Ms. Capier, my colleagues on both sides of the aisle talk about the importance of second chances, and clearly Mr. Uch seized that second chance and made the best of it. Would any of this ties to the community impact change his deportability? Would a judge be able to look at how he turned his life around and use discretion like they can for other people?
Unfortunately not. I'm happy to hear from Manny and his loved ones that he was able to do so. But for most people, the fact that they've turned their life around, et cetera, that does not matter. The judges do not have that discretion.
Now, I'm incredibly happy to say that just a few weeks ago, Manny became a U.S. citizen because he received a pardon from Washington State Governor Jay Inslee. How common are stories like Mr. Uch's, and how would a U.S. citizen in Mr. Uch's same situation be treated?
Yeah, so unfortunately, they're not common at all. They're rare. And I think it's wonderful that there were people on both sides of the aisle to see that, deportation is a one-size-fits-all punishment that is unnecessarily cruel and costly, both economically and on a human level. And so, again, his situation is common, but not the result that he was able to have eventually.
So we're talking about reforms to the immigration system today. How would a fair system with scalable consequences treat a case like Manny's?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the most complex areas. A scalable system would allow us to redefine penalties in immigration enforcement and ensure that they're proportional, right? Where one could be alternatives to detention, fines, community service, treatment programs, probationary period, really depending on what the underlying action and activity was. And so we need a system that provides judges and immigration authorities with the discretion to take the totality of the circumstances into account. As you mentioned, right, this is a time when our country is engaged in long overdue bipartisan discussions about the necessary changes to our criminal legal system. We should be doing the same with our immigration system.
Thank you. There's really no other area of U.S. law that just has one consequence. And I think that this is a critically important area for us to focus on, to establish scalable consequences that are fair, encourage compliance, and allow for second chances. And I have included that in my roadmap to freedom resolution as a core principle as we look to reform the system. Thank you, Ms. Hincapie, for your work, and I yield back, Madam Chair.
Ladies, time has expired. I understand that Mr. Biggs has had to leave. If he comes back, we will recognize him. But Mr. Tiffany is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I was just wondering if we can do anything about this unauthorized polar vortex that has hit northern Wisconsin with minus 25 tonight. Can we do anything about that?
Well, we could pass a law and make it warm. How about that?
Thank you for your time. I'm going to have a question here for Mr. Kirsenaw in just a minute in regards to the Flores decision. But I think when you look back at the last 4 years, we don't need to go into any theoretical or academic exercise here to see what changes are necessary. The things that have been done over the last few years have been very beneficial to those that live in this country. When you look at 2019, the highest wage increases for people, including in the lower income strata, that we've seen in decades. And that was because of getting control of the flow across the border, reducing the number of people coming across illegally from 10,000 a month to 1,000 a month last summer. So really that is a bold reform that truly has worked. And I would say to you that the Biden administration has made two very significant mistakes for working class Americans in his first couple weeks in office. First of all, killing the Keystone Pipeline. Two of the largest pipeline operators in the country are right here in Wisconsin, and we're going to have hundreds of people that make very good livings that are going to lose their jobs. But more importantly, down on the border, we have a looming border crisis that has just come about over the last couple weeks. In fact, I'm anxious to see if one of my colleagues, who a couple of years ago went down to the border and showed herself openly weeping at the cages down there, if she's going to protest what's going on as a result of the Biden administration's activities. When you hear of the caravans saying Joe Biden is now president, we can come across the border whenever we want to. There is a looming crisis that is happening down at the border. And I look forward to my colleague, in particular from New York, going down there and making a big hullabaloo about it like she did a few years ago. But my question to Mr. Kirsenaw is in regards to the Flores decision. As someone who's relatively new on this committee, or new on the committee, relatively new to the Judiciary Committee as a whole, could you give us some background on the Flores decision and why that it is so important to fix that decision?
You know what? I'm probably the last person to answer that question. You'd have to refresh my recollection. I dealt with it about 2 years ago, but not since that time.
That is no problem. Then I would like to address the question to, I'm sorry, the gentleman, his last name starts with a T, and I do not remember his name, and it does not appear on my screen. And but I wanted to ask him about the tech giants claim to need high-skilled employees. But I've heard from some constituents that they've actually been squeezed out of their jobs that worked in the computer and tech fields as a result of too much immigration. Can you comment on that?
I think it's Mr. Lettieri he's directing that to. Is that correct?
Madam Chair, thank you very much. That is correct. Thank you very much.
And I'm sorry, I'm not sure I fully understood the question. The question is about skilled immigration and what happens to American workers with skilled immigration?
Yeah, there was there's been talk by some of the tech companies. They've always advocated for more immigration into this country. They said we need these high-skilled people, and you see publications like the Wall Street Journal that have very much advocated for that over the last few decades. But I'm beginning to hear from some constituents who have worked in the tech field, that have worked on computer systems, those type of things. They say they are now being squeezed out. Have you heard any stories like that? And how do we ensure that we don't squeeze out our tech workers also?
Well, the empirical work on high-skilled immigration is pretty conclusive when it comes to the benefits that skilled immigrants bring to our economy. So setting aside any kind of anecdotal situations, which I'm not sure I'm familiar with what you're referring to, the benefits of immigration are strongest and most clear when it comes to skilled immigrants. Now, there's a good debate worth having about the method for how we welcome skilled immigrants into our economy. And my testimony dealt with two additive areas where I think we've really fallen short of taking advantage of what is an incredible national advantage. The fact that skilled and entrepreneurial people want to be here from around the world is an advantage that no other country enjoys the way the United States does, but for that reason, no other country squanders in the way that we do as well. And so in the same way that we would love to have more holders in our country, we'd love to have more entrepreneurs, more college graduates. This is a way of really bolstering our economy on a broad basis and improving life for a broad array of American workers and communities. But there's clearly ways that we can improve the way that we welcome skilled immigrants to our country.
The gentleman's time has expired. We thank you, and we'll now turn to Mr. Correa, gentleman from California, for just 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, Chairperson Lofgren. Thank you for holding this important hearing. We know our economy is better off because of hardworking immigrants, and this COVID-19 pandemic has shown that it is more apparent than ever. It's been undocumented, unauthorized immigrants that have continued to work in the fields, harvesting our crops, processing our food, farm workers, sanitation workers, teachers, childcare workers that have really kept us alive, so to speak, and fed. So, Mr. Chair, I wanted to ask you a question, if I can. About a year ago, before the pandemic, I got a phone call from a lobbyist from the food processing industry. Mississippi, I believe, was the state. He called me and I said, you know, what are you doing calling me? I represent California, not the South. And he said, look, you sit on the immigration subcommittee. And he said, we just had 400 workers deported from a food processing plant. And he said, the whole town, the whole region, the economy is shut down completely. And he said, Lou, it's not about wages, because all those workers are members of the Food and Commercial Workers Union. He said the only people that take those jobs are immigrants. Not even the children want to take those nasty jobs, but those are the people we need to import to keep our food processing business going. I've heard testimony today that immigrants compete with local American citizens, with residents for these jobs. But this is not anecdotal. This advocate for the food processing industry was pleading for us for help for additional immigrants. Do you say that's the case? Is it competition, or is it just, again, a structural issue? We don't have those workers in these places that take those jobs that Americans just don't want.
Well, thank you for the question. I think I'll refer back to Professor Hunt's testimony, where she talked about the various ways that immigrants complement or compete with native-born Americans. And it tends to be, from my understanding of the literature, it tends to be where the competition is the strongest, it's where the similarities are the strongest between the skill set of an immigrant and the skill set of the native-born worker. I think where there's strong agreement is that the distortive effects are clearest where there is a subset of the workforce that is not in the light, so to speak. It's not transparent and operating in the labor market in the way that native-born Americans do, and that creates those sort of effects. I think, as we've heard in this hearing, there's widespread agreement that we can do more about it. But the demand is the economic demand is what is bringing people to this country looking for work, and there clearly is demand. And so I think it's a question of.
If I may, in my short time.
Sure.
What you say is an issue is sub wages. Just give them a green card, and then they will essentially work for the legal wages, and they wouldn't be cutting or undercutting American citizens.
I would say without a doubt, the first step is bringing transparency to the labor market and operating on a level playing field. So without a doubt.
And the other issue that I have, and this is a question for Ms. Hincapie, is issue of deported veterans, judicial discretion. Right now in this country, we have green card holders that go and fight in Afghanistan, other parts of the world. They are honorably discharged. Then they come back to the U.S. and they're convicted of a certain enumerated crime, and they're essentially deported. And the only time these deported veterans that have fought for our country can go back to our country is when they die, because then they have the right to be buried in a veteran cemetery in the United States. How can you address that issue of repatriating these legal immigrants that should be Americans who were deported because of our archaic immigration laws? What do we do?
Yeah, thank you, Representative Correa. I mean, this is a similar question that Representative Jayapal asked about. I mean, it is shameful that we allow people to go fight for our country, yet if they make a mistake, oftentimes that mistake, that crime that they may have committed was probably as a result of PTSD and the psychological impact of the war that they were fighting. And so look, this is why we need to reform our system and give individuals a second chance and a chance at redemption. For those individuals who fought for our country and were deported, we should absolutely allow them to return to the United States, reunite them with their family, and put them on a path to citizenship.
So finally, I would say we need judicial discretion, I would say, in advocating, deciding some of these things in our immigration system, correct?
That is correct. Judicial discretion is needed throughout the entire system. Again, this level of a one-size-fits-all for all immigration cases just makes absolutely no sense.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you, ma'am.
And I understand Mr. Roy has had to step out for a minute. We'll recognize him if he's able to return. So now I would recognize Ms. Sparks of Indiana for 5 minutes for her questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As someone who is a big fan of Milton Friedman, who said that we cannot have open borders in welfare state, I'd like to have a quick discussion with you, because ultimately I don't see us reforming our welfare system, which needs a lot of reforms, but we have to look at legal immigration. And I have to agree with a gentlewoman from Washington that we need to have a better legal immigration system, but solution or illegal immigration, it's a bad solution. It's a bad solution for Americans. It's a bad solution people who cross the border illegally. So I think we have to do it better. And I think we need to see how we can better benefit our national interest. So my question is to, and I apologize if I say names wrong, but I'll try to do my best. Mr. Lettieri, he was mentioning about young and skilled workers, and we can address this only if we have a legal system. Otherwise, we don't know who crosses the border. So if you look at the legal immigration system, what percentage would you allocate to skilled workers and young workers, a more merit-based, which most countries have, versus unskilled workers, because there is a benefit for that too. So if you look at 100%, how would you allocate it within a legal immigration system?
Well, thank you for the question, Congresswoman. I would be reluctant to give you a percentage, but I'll give you an answer about scale, which is that we are nowhere close to welcoming the number of skilled immigrants to this country that we could absorb easily and who could benefit our country in a number of ways. And I think that's particularly true when it comes to immigrant entrepreneurs who have enormous assets they can offer to our country. We know the importance of entrepreneurship and its role in innovation and the kind of industries that really keep our economy the envy of the world. And again, this is a unique advantage of ours that not just skilled workers, but entrepreneurial workers from around the country want to be here.
Mentioned that too. You did a lot of research. What are your thoughts on the same question?
Well, this is exactly where I think subjectivity comes up. One can't really give an objective answer to this question. So I also am going to say that I can't give a proportion because it depends a little bit on how you trade off certain things, how concerned you are about high school dropouts versus the overall growth rate. For example, the innovative high-skilled immigrants increase the growth in GDP per capita, which will help everyone, but perhaps with some delay. But I will just note one thing. The share of the population in the US that's foreign born is 14%, 1-4, and that makes it 17th in the OECD in terms of the share. And Switzerland, Australia, New Zealand have in the 25 to 30% range of foreign born, most of them high skilled. So I'm just confirming my fellow witness in the sense that the US actually as a share has not very many foreign high skilled immigrants.
Okay, and then maybe Ms. Hincapie, if I said it right, do you believe we should have security on the border and we should secure the border regardless in how would we deal then with people that are here? We have to deal with this. It's a problem right now. But do you believe we need to secure the border?
Thank you for your question. It's Incapie, but you got close to it. So look, we actually, no problem. We actually have quite a bit of border security. We have as a nation spent, since the Department of Homeland Security was created, for example, $381 billion on both the border and interior enforcement. And I think one of the great things about the Biden administration and what is set forth in the U.S. Citizenship Act is to take a look at making sure that there is accountability and good border governance and management, as well as looking at the root causes of why people are coming and creating legal channels so that people can come through the ports of entry, seek asylum. Our asylum system has been decimated over the last 4 years. And so the ability for people to apply for asylum through the right legal channels is really critical.
Well, so we agree at least that we need to have border security, but maybe better enforcement. And Mr. Kirsanov, just quickly, do you believe how, if you look at the current situation and you talk about a lot of minority communities and really what's happening with our challenges in this community, how would you believe to address the current situation with people that are here across the border, undocumented? It means that in this case, I'm sure that I use the right word, unauthorized, who cross the border illegally. This is the new terminology. So how would you believe we need to make sure that we still don't put a burden on the welfare system that is right now in trouble, and we have a lot of people suffering and struggling. So what do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, and thank you for the question. I would respectfully disagree that we have good border security. That's belied by the fact that we've got approximately 30 to 40 million illegal immigrants here. We don't even know the number. And tens of thousands are crossing every month, if not hundreds of thousands in the near future. I think Milton Friedman has got it exactly right. You can't have a welfare state. You can have either a welfare state or open borders, but not both. And until we secure the border effectively, regardless of how much money we spend on it, until we secure that border, we're going to have a sieve coming across because the United States is a magnet for a host of reasons. Number one, it's the freest and best country in the world. Number two is you have wages that nobody else can match. Number three,
the lady's time has expired, but we'd ask you to wrap up the answer to your question. We don't want to cut you off.
I'm sorry, I went off a little bit of a tangent, but the bottom line here is you have to have better border security than we have now. Otherwise, even if you regularize those who are here, it's still going to be a magnet for people to come in and continue to work illegally.
The gentlelady's time has expired. I'd now like to recognize gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Garcia, for 5 minutes. You need to unmute.
I'm working on it. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this very critical hearing. While our country has witnessed and endured a tremendous amount of pain and struggle over the past 4 years, I'm committed to working with you and this committee and the Congress to work tirelessly to improve the lives of our most vulnerable communities and all hardworking Americans. As we prepare to reform our immigration system to accommodate our nation's most pressing needs, we must ensure that our immigration policies are rooted in our values of compassion, fairness, opportunity, and keeping families together. This is why I applaud the Biden-Harris administration, who on day one in office shared their immigration vision and signed executive orders prioritizing immigration reform and national healing. I think that what matters most to many of us, particularly those of us who've been working on this issue for many, many years, is that we do have to have immigration policy that keeps our families together. It must be a system that keeps our families together. And that's why I want to start my questions today with Ms. Hikapea, because I noted that she said that she was one of 10 children, as I am. And I know that she shares with me the value of family and faith and working together to ensure that we all get a good education and achieve our American dream. So, ma'am, I wanted to start with you because you're with the National Law Center. And last week I was working with a constituent here in my office who was detained by ICE this after, in fact, it happened to be the very day of the Corpus Christi court hearing where a district, federal district court judge in Corpus Christi held the ICE deportation pause that the administration had put in place through executive order as unlawful. What is NILC doing to address this issue, and how can we see some opportunities to continue to work together on this issue?
Yes, thank you, Representative Garcia. So yes, the family reunification must be at the core and center of all of our immigration policies. It's one of our tenets, and I believe that there's actually bipartisan support for family values and making sure that our families not only are not separated by our immigration policies, like we saw with the Muslim ban, we saw with the determination of DACA and temporary protected status, but actually that we're reunifying families, as the Biden administration has already started to begin the process of doing so with the creation of the task force, for example, for family reunification. And then secondly, making sure that as we create legal channels, as we provide people on a path to citizenship, again, that people are able to stay together as a family as well as in detention. And I think finally, I would say, with respect to the Texas decision last week, which was just a temporary injunction. It did not at all say that the moratorium was unlawful. It basically said that one small part of that moratorium needed to be put on hold while the legal proceedings continued. And so, look, the moratorium that the Biden administration has announced is critical. As a new administration, they should be able to say, and have the legal authority to do so, to say, we're going to hit the pause button while we decide what are the priorities under this new administration, and make sure that anyone who is in the Trump deportation pipeline does not get deported under the Biden administration.
Right. It's my understanding, though, that it was extended 2 more weeks.
That's correct.
Right. So are y'all fighting it in court, or what are the advocates doing in response to that?
Yes, so there is a group of organizations that did intervene in that lawsuit. We are not part of that lawsuit. And so as interveners, they will get a chance to provide the perspective of immigrant families. Separately, the Department of Justice under the Biden administration is also defending the moratorium.
Okay, now I want to move on to some of the ICE detention centers, of course, that we've visited. Several CODELs have been to several of them. I've been to many of them as a state senator, not only here in Texas, but in other places. And I'm mostly concerned with the lack of counsel, if you will, for a lot of these folks that are in detention, and even through the legal process itself once they leave the detention centers. So I wanted to discuss the whole issue of, do you think that we need to make sure that we provide counsel at every stage of every proceeding, or at what point does your center recommend that we look at providing counsel for anyone that is detained by ICE?
This is such a
lady's time has expired, but we'll ask the witness to answer promptly.
Absolutely. So at the National Immigration Law Center, we've worked with local communities across the nation to provide funding to provide universal legal representation. The statistics all show that when someone has a lawyer, they comply and show up for their legal proceedings and then get to be able to go through the legal proceedings. Immigration law is considered one of the most complicated legal labyrinths separate from tax law. And so again, having legal counsel is absolutely necessary.
Thank you, and I yield back.
The other gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Escobar, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and thank you for this very important hearing. I want to thank all of our panelists for their great information. I would like to address some things that I have heard through this hearing. I heard from one of our colleagues talk about successes over the last 4 years when it comes to immigration. I've heard from another colleague that we have to quote unquote secure the border before we attempt to address immigration reform. I've also heard from one of our panelists that our economy is some sort of zero-sum game, a race to the bottom to preserve low-wage jobs for Americans, especially Americans of color. And I find, and also, of course, always we hear the talking point of open borders. And so I want to just take a few quick minutes to address that. I represent the US-Mexico border. I'm the only member of this subcommittee, and I believe the only member of the Judiciary Committee that lives, works, represents an actual border community. And so I can tell you, I can assure my colleagues that we have, as a country, spent hundreds of billions of dollars securing and militarizing the border. And border communities have long been among the safest in the nation. And we are very proud to recognize ourselves as the new Ellis Island. I also want to mention that the last 4 years were not a success if you are a humanitarian. The last 4 years, my community bore witness to some of the cruelest anti-immigrant public policy that we will have ever witnessed in our generation. My district was the testing ground for family separation that to this day we have not remedied, but that many of us are committed to remedying. We have seen force feeding in ICE facilities. We have seen inhumane holding conditions and a complete obliteration of asylum law, among many other horrific practices that, by the way, never addressed root causes, as Ms. Incape mentioned, and that never actually stopped migration. I would also like to point out that migration has continued and that it will continue until we work collaboratively, which this current administration has chosen to do with our Western Hemisphere partners. I want to use a little bit of my time. So I wanted to just say I needed to get that out so that I could help share with my colleagues the view from the border, the perspective from the border. And I would also like to say in 2019, I hosted about 20% of Congress in CODELs to the border. And once we're past COVID, I invite my colleagues to join me on a visit. I would be delighted to show you the border through my eyes. Mr. Lettieri, I want to ask you about the economic argument because there's so much that is advantageous about immigration. With a declining population, we need young people. As we've seen, really there is no impact on wages, as study after study has shown, unless, again, we're in a race to the bottom. But as you know, and as you mentioned, immigrants are much more likely to start businesses than American-born citizens. They are more entrepreneurial. Can you discuss how entrepreneurship helps stimulate economic growth?
Sure, and thank you for the question, Congresswoman. It does so in a number of ways. Entrepreneurship is critical to our economy because it's a driver of productivity gains. It's a driver of job creation. Every year, the bulk of net new jobs created come from young and fast-growing companies. And so the engine of job creation really begins with new business formation. I pointed out in my written testimony, this is actually an area that should be a concern to policymakers today because we still have not recovered the startup rates and entrepreneurial activity that we had prior to the Great Recession. In spite of a very long economic expansion that followed, about a decade's worth of economic expansion, we still haven't seen startup rates go back up to where they were prior to the Great Recession. And so, again, as we think about immigration policy, my plea to the committee is to think about its economic potential, particularly in this space of entrepreneurial dynamism and innovation. These are things that are just absolutely critical to our economy and where we know study after study, the wide body of empirical work that's been done on this demonstrates that immigrants are very good for American entrepreneurship. If you look at the Fortune 500 and you see that over 40% of Fortune 500 companies are founded by immigrants or the children of immigrants, anecdotally and empirically, there's really no argument to be made here that immigration is good for American entrepreneurship. But again, being more intentional about how we encourage that would be, I think, one of the key features of immigration reform.
Thank you. I'm out of time. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Gentlelady yields back. We have 3 members from Texas, and I now recognize the third gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for 5 minutes. Sheila.
Thank you very much. Let me acknowledge the chair and the ranking member for this committee. Let me be honest, and the virtual meetings pose some difficulties at times in muting and unmuting, but I'm always here, and I'm always here at these committee hearings where I'm called upon to be. So forgive me for the unmute and mute process on these devices. I'm delighted that the hearing is a concept that is partly a remedy or cure, if you will, for the 4 years of devastation and demeaning of immigrants across America. And frankly, leaving the world questioning what our values really are. And so it is important that we start anew almost, having been on this committee for a sizable number of years, to really go bold. As I do so, let me also indicate that over the years I've served as a ranking member of this committee, we have seen the opportunities taken to use African Americans as a wedge issue. And there are those who are probably listening at this point who happen to be African American, who may feel challenged by the increasing diversity of this nation, inasmuch as their voices have always been for justice for all. And I see that in my community and the collaboration that we have here in Texas, where there's much collaboration between immigrant groups and the African American community. We do want to make sure that, in fact, all communities, as one of my colleagues said, have justice and access to economic opportunities, the kinds of wages, which include the minimum wage being raised to $15 an hour, and really just the opportunity for education, for business access, healthcare access. And that should be our highlight. This is not the Ways and Means Committee or the Energy and Commerce Committee, but this is a committee that can, in fact, provide an economic engine to this nation and provide a pathway for citizenship, but also for opportunity. So first of all, I'd like to submit into the record a document by Wade Henderson, a friend of ours of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, who's testified numerous times before this committee. Mr. Henderson points out, asked unanimous consent to submit that into the record.
Ordered.
Thank you. Mr. Henderson points out that there is no consensus among economists on the role immigration plays in longstanding Black unemployment rates. Second, there are a lot of reforms to anti-discrimination labor laws and job training that would far more directly address Black unemployment. And third, African Americans still overwhelmingly support immigration reform that provides a path to citizenship, and they really are not eager, these are his words, to appreciate, are not eager and may not appreciate and do not appreciate scapegoating or using them as a wedge. I will say that there are probably voices that want to have more work. There are voices who want to be in college. There are voices who want to have access to business and access to capital, but we want to do it collectively. And I want to say openly, let's do it collectively. I believe if we move this nation toward HR 40, the Commission to Study and Develop Reparations proposals, we will look globally at the treatment of African Americans, excuse me, and in this country, and begin to go boldly. Let me quickly ask 2 questions, and I can't see the clock, so forgive me. But let me quickly ask the question to Ms. Hinapaya.
You have a minute.
On the issue of the importance of moving forward on the legal status of DACA recipients, let me quickly ask Mr. Lettieri on my question of economics and how economics can empower his new immigrants, individuals who may get access to citizenship, mixed in with African Americans and Black immigrants, which have traditionally been second class as it relates to the immigration structure. So, forgive me if I Anapea, please forgive me, my voice just cracked.
No
For
worries.
DACA,
Thank
please.
you, Representative Jackson Lee. Yes, so we at the National Immigration Law Center have had the great honor of representing courageous DACA recipients all the way up to the Supreme Court. And we have a temporary victory and represent 1.1 million class members who are DACA recipients or applicants for DACA. But DACA is a temporary reprieve from deportation. And here's where we need you and your leadership. We need Congress to pass the Dream and improve a version of the Dream and Promise Act swiftly so that they can become citizens ASAP.
The gentlelady's time has expired, but let's ask Mr. Lettieri to very quickly answer her question if he could.
I thank the chairwoman for indulging. Thank you, Mr. Lettieri. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think, as I said in my testimony, one of the best ways to boost the benefits economically of immigration is to ensure that legacy city communities, which are often very diverse and have large communities of color from all different backgrounds, that they are exposed to the benefits of immigration the same way that large booming coastal metro areas are. We currently have no intentional policy in that regard, and so those are areas that tend to miss out on the benefits that skilled immigration in particular could bring to those communities and arrest the decline that we see over many decades in their local economies.
Thank you. We now have, I would like to recognize Mr. Neguse is not here. Ms. Scanlon, the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Lofgren, and thank you to our witnesses for being here for this hearing. I'm glad we're having this conversation about all the ways in which immigrants make our country a better and more prosperous place. I do want to take a minute to address a nuance that we should always keep in mind. I mean, the empirical evidence has been clear for decades that a fair and robust immigration system is critical to our country's economic health. But the value of our immigrant neighbors is not simply a question of dollars and cents. Our immigrant communities bring with them innovation, culture, resilience, and we're lucky to have people from all over the world seek a brighter future in our borders. In my district, 1 in 10 of my constituents are foreign born. Our immigrant neighbors drive innovation in business, educational excellence at our universities, and make immeasurable cultural contributions. My district's home to some of the largest immigrant populations from Ireland, Liberia, and Cambodia in the US. In the schools in Upper Darby Township, which is a township of 80,000 people, they speak more than 80 languages and dialects. We have folks who are Bengali, Sikh, Central American, Greek, and Korean, people from Southeast Asia, Venezuela, Eritrea, Armenia, Bhutan, and a host of African countries call my district home. And one of the leading drivers of our regional economy is research and technology, which is reliant upon talented foreign workers. So all of which is to say that this is a huge and very important issue for my district. Mr. Lettieri, you testified about entrepreneurial energy that immigrants bring to our community, and I certainly see that in my district. To paraphrase Lin-Manuel Miranda, immigrants get the job done. So we've heard the research about immigrants being almost twice as likely to start businesses, and your report concludes that maybe we need a heartland visa. And can you just discuss a little bit more about how that would work and how it could revitalize some of the areas where we have population decline?
Sure. Thank you for the question. So what I called for in my testimony is really a two-pronged approach to expanding the ways and opening new doors for skilled immigrants to connect with American communities. One is through a Heartland visa, which would be targeted to places that are struggling economically and demographically. And the second would be through a startup visa that would specifically open a door for immigrant entrepreneurs, much like more than a dozen other countries already do for the exact same type of talent that we turn away. Both of those would have enormous job creating, wealth creating, economic growth creating effects because simply what we know about the way that skilled immigrants interact with our economy. And we see this in study after study, and we see this in local communities as well. Many of the communities that would be eligible for Heartland visa, the only reason that their economies have started to turn around recently, the only reason that they are seeing positive population growth is because they've become very intentionally more welcoming to immigrants. And so the economic potential there is very clear. And it's important to think about what happens if we don't take an approach like this. When you lose population, you're seeing a shrinking tax base, you're seeing a shrinking demand for local businesses, you're seeing the degradation of local services, which encourage more people to leave, and you get into this downward spiral that's very hard to reverse. And that need not be so. But this is just one of those areas where we have failed to connect the dots that immigration can be such a powerful economic development tool, where we align the interests of communities with the aspirations of would-be immigrants.
In some of the areas in my district where there'd been kind of a downgrading of the economy, et cetera, I'm thinking specifically of the African area of Southwest Philadelphia, which is experiencing a revitalization as a result. I wanted to get to a question for Professor Hunt. We've heard some discussion about the impact of illegal immigrants on wages for low-income Americans. But what we're talking about here is providing status for undocumented workers, bringing them out of the shadows, which I would think would make it harder for unscrupulous employers to pay substandard wages or impose unsafe or illegal conditions with impunity. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I agree with you. When workers have legal status, they have greater bargaining power that will increase their wages. And as an earlier witness said, they'll be more able to report poor workplace practices without fear of reprisal.
Okay, making the workplace safer for everyone. Thank you.
Young lady's time has expired. I think Mr. Buck and Mr. Roy were unable to return, so I will now recognize myself. First, I'd ask unanimous consent to put into the record statements from 17 organizations on this subject. Without objection, so ordered. I'll just say thank you to all of the members who were able to participate today in this hearing. We have a lot of work ahead of us on this subcommittee and in the full committee as well when it comes to the issue of immigration. And there are some themes of disagreement that have emerged here today, but I think there are also some elements of consensus that we can work on. When I listen to questions about immigration security and enforcement, I don't think there's a single person in the Congress who is against enforcing the laws of the United States. What we're saying is the laws need to serve the best interests of the United States. When I think about farm workers, and I authored a bill for the farm worker segment of the economy that was agreed to both by the United Farm Workers Union and the growers and farmers of the United States. When you talk about, unlawful entry or unauthorized entry, 80% of the farm workers are undocumented, and a majority of them came more than 10 years ago. So we're talking about border enforcement in 2005. We have to take, a comprehensive fact-based view of what's going on, and then the screen is what's best for the United States of America. I'm interested, in all of the testimony. Has been very interesting and helpful. But Mr. Lettieri, I was interested in your Heartland visa. I'm just about ready to introduce a startup visa that I've been working on for many months with the help of the academic community and venture capitals and the like. But the Heartland visa is an interesting idea. Right now we have mayors who sometimes step forward and say, send us refugees because they need that workforce, but we don't have a capacity to say, send us entrepreneurs or somebody who's going to establish a center of excellence that's going to grow the economy in a different way. Be more specific, if you would, on how the Heartland visa would work.
Thank you, Chair Lofgren. I'd love to. So what we propose in a Heartland visa is that given the fact that 80% of the country's counties are seeing a shrinking of their prime working age population, which is a startling fact, many places would love to have a specific type of visa program by which they could opt in, number one. So in our concept, a county or an eligible area has to opt in and say, we want to be a part of this program. They have to commit resources to implementing it so that new immigrants can be a success. And number three, the would-be visa holder has to opt in to settling in that particular place. So it's a dual opt-in type of match that ensures that there's going to be a lot of information transparency on both sides, and you're going to have a good fit between the immigrant and the local community. But the idea is that communities that are struggling with this demographic and economic decline that's affecting so much of the country would have its own class of high-skilled visas that would be eligible for, so that the benefits of high-skilled immigration are more broadly felt around the country than it is today. And there's a reason that this idea has gotten the broad bipartisan support of, say, the U.S. Conference of Mayors. You mentioned mayors in your question. They have almost unanimously endorsed this. And many individual mayors from legacy cities, such as Akron and Dayton, have publicly endorsed this as well, for the very reason that they know the role that immigration is playing in their economy today. And the big challenge that they have is U.S. federal policy doesn't support their local efforts. So they can do everything that's possible that they can do in their toolkit as a mayor, but still they're running up against the barriers presented by federal policy. So the idea here is, let's open a door that supports the local work on the ground and opens up a new channel for skilled immigrants to connect with communities who would love to have them.
Well, thank you very much. As I said, I'm just about ready to introduce my startup visa, but I think I'm going to put that on a temporary hold and do a chapter 2 to have it include also a Heartland visa.
I would work with you on that.
I live in San Jose, California, where about half of the people who live here were born in another country. They're Americans by choice. And we had, before the pandemic, probably the biggest GDP growth of any area in the United States. And it was fueled by the tech sector and fueled by people who came to get their PhDs and then started companies here, and which then ended up hiring many, many, many Americans. The anti-immigrant policies that flowed at times during the last administration discouraged people from coming as students. We had a decline in the number of people coming as foreign students, and that really was a tremendous adverse impact on the pipeline of people going in to start companies. And what we saw was that recruiters from other parts of the world, and especially Canada, came down to Silicon Valley and started recruiting people away because they would provide for legalization and we would not. And for a while, I think it's all been upended by COVID, but it will change once the virus is in the rearview mirror, hopefully soon. The tech economy in Toronto was actually growing faster than the tech economy in Silicon Valley, and it was almost entirely because of their immigration policies. We can change that, and we can make the United States more prosperous if we use good sense in crafting our immigration policies. So I want to thank every one of our witnesses for their testimony. I'm sorry, who?
McClintock here. A couple of quick things. I'd like to ask unanimous consent that the Republican staff report on Trump immigration successes be entered into the record.
Without objection.
And I'd also like to ask unanimous consent. I believe Mr. Biggs had a statement and have that included.
Without objection, that will be included.
Great, thank you.
With that, we are about to adjourn this hearing. Once again, all members have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witnesses or additional materials for the record. And as we conclude this hearing, I want to thank all of the members and all of the witnesses for their participation and their willingness to work together in the future so that our policies serve our country well. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.